Welcome, everyone, to the January 26th City Council work session. Today we are having another segment in the conversation on Envision Eugene, and today it's on environmental stewardship. City Manager?
Thank you, Mayor, very much, and we're happy to be back. Let me introduce a couple other people that are at the table that you may know. Rusty Rexius is part of our community resource group. Larry Banks also is part of that group. And Matt McRae, you know from city staff, who has done this yeoman work on the Community Energy Action Plan. And so today's topic is talking about sort of the environmental side of the triple bottom line. When we're thinking about Envision Eugene, you might remember one of the key frameworks that we want to view this through, that you'll be seeing as part of that evaluation process, is the triple bottom line. And a couple of weeks ago we talked about some economic development pieces of it. A week or so ago we had social equity, and now we're doing the environmental side. I think one thing that's important to remember is while we're presenting each of these as independent topics, at the end of the day they all become integrated topics, and it's really about balance. And so when we present the portfolio to you of different recommendations, we'll want to think about it in the context of balance. One of the ways that we're trying to frame this to get at that is through what we're calling these 7 pillars of Envision Eugene. And I want to just talk a little bit about that. If I do the slide, or you do it? Yeah. I'll do it for you.
Sounds like Greek mythology.
How to turn it on.
It does a little bit.
Those details that sometimes is sort of get tougher. We introduced these to you a couple of weeks ago, and we're kind of still going through and wordsmithing some of these, so the actual words will kind of change over time. But the purpose of these really is all of the complexity and the challenges and the information and the analysis that goes into an Envision Eugene process. We're trying to create a framework in which we and the general public can get a pretty quick snapshot of, so what is it you're really trying to accomplish? And that's what these are intended to do. They don't replace the community resource groups. We've talked a lot about best outcomes. We have Envision Eugene principles. All those are still important, but we're trying to capture it in a way that people can take a look at it, they can see it, and it makes sense, and then we can start to put strategies underneath those. But let me just talk briefly about these before we go back one more. Yeah, sorry. The other piece that I think people start to recognize when we show this is that it is complex, and there are a lot of woven pieces. They intermingle, and so it really is about the balance of all of these as we continue to move forward. What I want to go through briefly today is putting some of the strategies that the CRG is starting to land on underneath some of these pillars, and to give you a sense of what some of those are, so you can start thinking about those, because you'll see a lot of those again, and I'll talk about them briefly. So let's move on. So one of those pillars is promoting compact urban development and efficient transportation, and in this context it talks a lot about commercial land need. This conversation actually came up at the work session last week a little bit when we were talking about MX on Monday. And the conversation really started to think about development along transit corridors and in what we're referring to as core commercial centers. So some of those core commercial centers may not actually be on a transit center or corridor, but there are places in which we can reasonably increase density, particularly around multifamily, around commercial uses, and accommodate some of that growth. The connection back to the MX conversation on Monday was, if one of our visions is to increase density and accommodate a portion of our growth on these corridors. One of the things that has been talked about in the Community Energy Action Plan, as well as in a variety of forums, is a transit system to support that, to make that successful. So that starts to tie some of those conversations together. And so one of the things that the council will be taking a look at as we move into Envision Eugene is do you envision that a portion of our growth will be through increased density along these transit corridors and in core commercial centers? So that's a piece of that. Let's go to the next one. Another part of this particular strategy, and there'll be more under these strategies, but when we talk about that edge or that transition between neighborhoods and these transit corridors, what that looks like, what that feels like, how we are trying to protect and restore the livability of the neighborhood, that edge or that transition zone becomes very critical. And how are we going to view that? How are we going to protect that? What is it that we want that to look like? And so that becomes an important piece of the conversation that you'll see when we move forward. One of the pillars is affordable housing, and the opportunity siting program or project that's been underway is one way to do that. This will, when I start talking about livability in neighborhoods, some of these things will start to tie back to some of that. But we're also talking about the types of housing that we may be able to provide. And what I should have said on the one before on the community, or I'm sorry, on the commercial land use, one of the conclusions that we are coming out of the CRG is that we'll be able to accommodate our future commercial land use within the existing UGB. In good part on the strategies that you saw before around increasing some or putting some of that growth in these core commercial centers. We've also said that our future multifamily housing need can also be accomplished or accommodated within our existing UGB. Part of it has to do with that kind of compact urban development. Part of it has to do with opportunity siting. And then we need to do that in the context of the affordable housing. Protecting, repairing, and enhancing neighborhood livability. The first bullet on there is probably the key strategy that is coming out of the CRG. What that says essentially is that if we weren't going through this process, if we weren't doing anything different, there's a certain amount of growth that we can expect to happen in the neighborhoods naturally. And that's going to naturally occur. What we're saying is we're not going to accommodate additional growth that wouldn't occur naturally in the neighborhoods, in the core neighborhoods. I shouldn't say core, in the neighborhoods. So that's a policy decision, which is different than saying we're actually going to not only accommodate natural growth, but we're actually going to put more density in those neighborhoods. So that will be a decision. The CRG is landing on we're not going to do that, which then says the transition and edges become critical, and if we really are wanting to protect and enhance neighborhood livability, the ICS project, the infill compatibility standards project becomes very critical in how we do that, as well as opportunity siting, because there are places in which density can be put into neighborhoods, but it's really as a result of opportunity siting, not as a result of increasing density across the entire neighborhood. So those are policy level decisions that we're going to be asking you to make, and these are the things that are coming out of the CRG.
So, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got one too.
Sorry, want me to go back? So these are kind of posed as different.
No, these are all strategies underneath that.
Right.
This isn't the choices here. What I'm suggesting to you is what's coming out of the CRG.
Right. They're not.
What you're seeing here.
They're not mutually exclusive either.
Right. Right. Go ahead.
Is there another question over here before you?
Mine's more substantive in discussion rather than style of
Okay.
presentation, so.
So, John, along with that recommendation from the CRG will be code changes that, so when somebody
Okay.
buys property, they know ahead of time that they can't put a, whatever the code is allowed at this time?
The answer is yes. There will have to be code that, if there isn't already existing code to implement these, that will have to also occur. So, for example, this next bullet starts to get at a little bit of that. What we talk about is how are you actually going to ensure some of these things? And we talk about specific area plans, neighborhood plans, refinement plans, overlays, or different techniques for doing that, which then will eventually get to a code.
And so people who own the property now will be grandfathered in, or will they have to bite the bullet?
I just want to clarify, I'm not sure if just want to clarify, it's not looking at reducing allowable densities, it's saying that we wouldn't want to increase densities over what's currently allowed.
I understand.
So there
Okay.
wouldn't be a need for grandfathering. We might
Okay.
have additional infill compatibility standards to protect
So
those.
does that include design? I mean, because what I hear from people is more about the ugliness
Right.
of the buildings.
That, it will include additional efforts to increase compatibility. So yes, it could be, and in particular on the edges and transition areas, there might be some need for design standards or something like that. That's all part of the package that we'll be bringing forward.
Okay.
2 slides back, you talked about the focus for redevelopment efforts and mixed use and higher density housing on the transit corridors in a couple of those places. That's kind of
commercial centers, yeah.
as a kind of core underlying concept. You also said that we probably, even though the ECLA information showed a negative balance, a need for 480 acres of commercial, you've said we'll essentially be able to accommodate it by putting more commercial into areas where it's not now, right? More like what we're talking about here with these particular areas, right?
Yeah, and there'll be some other things around. We may rezone some of our
And there's my question.
small industrial areas that really.
How much of West 11th is going to need to be rezoned to accommodate what we're talking about here?
I don't know. I don't know if we have that.
I'm not sure if I can quantify that today, but I think what you might see is a mix of uses. So where you have some more light industrial, you might have commercial that would be compatible with that. You might also see multifamily mixed use in that area.
Let me then just ask a broader, higher, 30,000-foot question. What just real rough, what percentage of West 11th as it currently exists are we talking about changing long-term for the future in terms of its density in order to accomplish what we're trying to do?
Well, I think what we've assumed so far is that we'd see like about a 25% redevelopment rate in that area. Or, I mean, and that's not even something that we put out there as a fixed assumption, but it was a starting point for consideration. What would it look like? And you might recall an earlier presentation where we showed you a slide of the
And what's
current
the time
densities.
horizon?
Is that over 20 years? Over 20 years.
So over the next 20 years, at least a quarter of that will change.
Redevelop.
But remember, we're also talking about the corridor. It's not just what adjacent to 11th, right? So
Well,
if
that's
we're
what-
defining the corridor in the CRG, it's a broader.
Half mile.
It's,
Quarter mile, right?
is it quarter mile? I forget what
They sort of
exactly it
looked
is.
at that
And each
quarter
one will be a
mile.
little bit different, but yes, that's kind of what we generally
Yeah,
say.
I was
So
just
it's a
really
little bit-
asking, I know that this has broader impacts, I was just kind of asking, what does that mean when we're talking about West 11th? Because again, I'm trying to get specific about the conversation we need to have so that we can stop having arguments about it and
So
be
so
real
one
about
of the
what we're talking
decisions
about.
that council will be making
Uh-huh.
will be some assumptions around the redevelopment rate.
Okay.
Because we will make some assumptions around a redevelopment rate.
Mhm.
And and just to foreshadow, my intent will be to be aggressive but not unrealistic.
Okay.
Coming in as a recommendation. And the reason why for that will be a couple things. One, if we're really wanting to have a compact urban environment, part of that means is we really are going to have to do some of that, but we can't just be impractical about that. So it may be a little bit aggressive. The other piece that then balances that for me is we'll be coming in with how do we have these periodic check-ins in which we can evaluate what we're doing and make changes, sort of calling audibles at the line
Sure.
over time, which then provide sort of that safety net, really on both sides of the equation. But the council will need to decide if you really think the redevelopment rate isn't 25 because that's too aggressive, if that's what comes in, it really needs to be 10% based on something else. That then will feed into the equation of what does that mean for land use for different types of land uses.
Right.
So there is some of that. And what our intent will be is to be able to bring you information to help evaluate that. And some of it is, it'll be subjective based a little bit on what you're willing to do as we go forward in order to make some of these things happen, right? So that's where some of all this comes together. So some of that's going to be that conversation which gets at that.
Okay, thanks.
If I could just add one little thing to that is that what they'll be probably bringing, I mean, this is a moving, it's still moving, so nothing's in cement yet.
Right, so that's part of what the ongoing conversation is.
So you know, what part of the conversation is some of the tools that could be used to help certain things happen if that's what we choose to do,
Right.
is also driven by market circumstances
Right.
and whether there's an interest from the market in doing some of the things
Right.
that.
Right.
So it's that
Yeah.
combination.
And does that, within current zoning, mostly within current zoning, the redevelopment?
I think that, well, I think when we did that and talked about 25%, that was an exercise that we went through to sort of see what it would look like and how much might you see over a 20-year period. That was assuming some rezoning of some of the parcels, so,
But not wholesale, just
no,
modest.
right.
Can we come back later with the rough percentage of rezoning, like my original question of you, when you can?
I don't know if we have that level of detail yet.
But as
When we get
there.
But as we move into the conversation, there will have to be, there will be some of that kind of conversation that goes on. But
By 1:30?
so,
No rush.
115.
No rush.
but what I will say, though, is the level of detail. Remember, there is going to be some additional detail that has to occur based on what the decisions of council are.
Right.
Because what I have not wanted to do is send staff on an infinite amount of data if you're not even interested in moving down a particular path. So we want to make sure you're taking a path, then we'll make sure there's more data that if there is some that needs to be done to play that out. So,
Okay.
so there's a different level. But on just a couple other quick things on this, a good example, Andrea, I think, I was kind of alluding to on the specific area plans and neighborhood plans. Part of what we're wanting to do is, if we're wanting to protect them, there are some things that eventually could translate into different kind of codes, and there are some areas. A good example of an area is in the Suna neighborhood on 19th. There's kind of an edge there that is really kind of on the front line of development in that area. That may be a good place where an overlay exists. So you don't even have to do the whole neighborhood. There could be a specific area in a neighborhood for those kinds of things. 20-minute neighborhoods, we've talked a little bit about that. But that, while that feels like it's, okay, we can just throw that out there, there actually is a fundamental look and feel that how that plays itself out over 30 or 40 or 50 years. And so is that what we want? So
Just, you made me think of my neighborhood when I put it in that template. So how will that apply if, say, for instance, is there any, we always want to talk about what kind of neighborhood we want our neighborhood to look like. And like my neighborhood is kind of over inundated with less than desirable type businesses, bars and video parlor places, the nudie bars on Highway 99. Is there any way to, in this thought process, is there any way to somehow minimize the impact of that type of growth? Not that, I think there should be a dispersal policy like there is for housing, because I think that, Highway 99 is over inundated with that, and also with social services. They're more than welcome to be there, but I'm just posing the question in this conversation.
Before we go any further and you answer that question.
Well, you don't have to answer, at this point, but if you would just take it under.
I just want to ask that we keep a queue.
okay.
That was my time, Mayor.
Sorry. Let me take a quick gander on it, but there'll be a lot more information.
Okay.
River Road is a important transit corridor. Part of that eventually it'll have to be timed of when do we actually go in and create the I'm going to say overlay, and it might not be the technical planning term for that, an overlay for that area that says, here's what that land use into the future we would like that to be. Now, how you transition to that could be a whole lot of different ways of doing that. We've talked about form-based code, or I know hybrid form-based code, and I say that for Alan because I know he has some pure form-based code. But so form-based code in some of these areas, which could be different for different corridor. So we're talking about those kinds of things. So eventually, that could talk about land use in that corridor as well. Right, but that's all right. That's it for me.
That's good.
Okay. I'm turning this over to Robin.
Okay.
That's good clarification.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Robin Hostick, Senior Planner with Planning Division. With me today is Matt McRae, who's a Climate and Energy Analyst with the city. And what we're going to do is...
Let's introduce Kate real quick. I'm sorry, Kate. I see that you've joined us at the table. Kate Pearl is also one of our Community Resource Group members and is a supplier of mixed green seeds. As one of our productive farmers in town.
So we're going to tag team a little bit and walk you through just some brief framing of the environmental stewardship concept. And there are a few key topic areas underneath that. And I just want to say up front that any one of these is worthy of days of discussion. So we're going to be just kind of hitting the high points here. Obviously, environmental stewardship is incredibly important to the community, and there's a lot of evidence for that. Just to name a few, the adoption of the environmental policy in 2000, agreement on sustainability principles a few years after that, and most recently, of course, the endorsement of the Climate and Energy Action Plan. And here you can just see some language recently agreed upon by the Council as it pertains to environmental stewardship, talking about being stewards of our physical assets and natural resources, sustaining our clean air and clean water and beautiful parks and livable and safe neighborhoods. So we've also heard a lot from the community. In particular, we've had many conversations, as you know, with the Community Resource Group, and in fact, just recently a question was posed to the group that asked them what would be the evidence that we have addressed natural resource and climate and energy concerns through this process. So the way that folks answered the first half of that question about natural resources, there's a variety of different ways that people responded, everything from protecting sensitive habitats to setting aside land for open space to even technical concerns like John just mentioned with form-based code. So there's quite a range there. What would be the evidence that we've responded to climate and energy issues? As you might expect, a lot of these responses had to do with transportation. And of course, there is also a quote here, a reduced footprint for housing, and we'll mention a little later on how that fits in. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Matt to talk about some key trends and issues around greenhouse gases.
All right. Really quickly, as you're all aware, greenhouse gases being primarily a result of burning fossil fuels, we should also keep in mind the impacts from burning fossil fuels on air quality. Auto-related air pollutants are decreasing overall in our community, but there are still concerning auto-related emissions, including diesel particulate and benzene. But as we look at greenhouse gas emissions and their influence on climate change, just a reminder, I know, again, we've all talked about quite a bit of this through the Climate and Energy Action Plan, but just again the projections of what we might anticipate here in our community. Warmer, wetter winters, increased storm intensity, increased likelihood of flooding and reduced summer snowpack, as well as warmer, drier summers, potential for climate migration or climate refugees, and increased risk of wildfire in our surrounding areas. While we need to prepare for these projected impacts, it's also important that we reduce our local greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce the potential for these impacts. So again, a reminder as far as some of the sources of our greenhouse gas emissions, we'll be focusing specifically on local passenger transportation and energy use in buildings because they are most connected to our land use decisions and combined make up about 40% of our greenhouse gas footprint. The next 3 slides are going to outline some of the key strategies being held up nationally as methods to reduce greenhouse gases associated with land use. The first two are shown here, and probably are have similar language to the highlights that John started with. So increasing housing density in the urban core and along major transit corridors, and mixing residential and commercial uses within small geographic areas. So that kind of gets at the 20-minute neighborhood concept that we've discussed before. In addition, recognizing that in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, an ample, high-quality walking, biking, and transit infrastructure is needed. And finally, in addition to land use and transportation, Envision Eugene can have an influence on home sizes and configurations. This graphic from a study commissioned by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality demonstrates that smaller homes and multifamily homes, those that are also typically more affordable, also tend to have reduced environmental impacts across the board. The red bar on this chart represents the impacts from the average medium-sized home across a variety of environmental measures, including waste generation, climate change, human health, ecosystem quality, and resource depletion. The study found that the most effective ways to reduce impacts across these categories is to shift towards smaller homes, which is represented here by the kind of blue-gray bar, and multifamily homes, which is that yellowish-green bar there. So that's the end of my segment. And I'll hand it back to Robin.
You want to ask something about
I do. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. One piece back on the fourth slide where you were talking about what you've heard in the inputs you got, I assume, where you're trying to drive towards developers set aside more land for open space. Form-based code allows flexibility in how this is done. Does that mean, for example, that we're talking about when a development area is done, you're talking about common areas, or does that mean undeveloped areas?
Hardscape.
These quotes are taken specifically from quotes from CRG members as a part of that listening. So I don't know that I can answer.
Yeah, it kind of would depend on how the person that said it was thinking about it.
I guess I'm asking, what are we doing with this information as it translates to how it's going to drive our decision-making? So if you're using that as a representation of the sorts of things people were saying, what does that drive in terms of the sorts of decisions we should be making? And the reason I ask is because there's quite a conversation taking place on net versus gross acres when we're talking about residential development. And if this is a key consideration that we should be looking at more open space within developments, and I want to understand what its effect will be.
And I guess I think what Robin's saying is that this is not characterizing a key strategy that came out of the CRG. Rather, it's a sampling of some of the comments we heard when we asked what evidence we would have that we'd responded to natural resources. And so I think largely the open space conversations we're having is in more collective open space rather than within a development.
Okay.
In fact, we've even heard some comments to the contrary, that you shouldn't look specifically within a development for the open space. I mean, that's not a key strategy that's emerged.
Okay. Then lastly, 3 slides later, 4 slides later, one of the things you're talking about in terms of local impacts of climate change is climate migration and refugees. And I'm wondering, has that, in the work that Sustainability Commission has done, has that been quantified in any way, what we might expect in terms of, our neighbors from California moving this way? What we might expect?
Some of us already have.
I was going to say, brother, and welcome, by the way.
Right, all those from California, raise your hand.
Yeah, there you go. So is there any quantifiable work of the Sustainability Commission on that at all?
I haven't seen anything that quantifies those. There are currently trends out of the center of the U.S. towards the coast, and when we look at projections of temperature change over the course of the next 80 years, there are significantly hot areas, particularly in Southern California and Arizona, that would suggest that those areas might become really uncomfortable. Places where there are projected up to 4 months a year over 100 degrees. So
we've seen, in looking, that Oregon has seen an increase in the net increase of people moving in migration into Oregon. And so my question is, did PSU, when they did the county's population forecasting, take climate refugees into account when they came up with the 34,000 number?
I sure don't know that answer, but Councilor Zelenka is saying no.
So if we're counting on in-migration from climate refugees, we're going to actually have more people here than we're planning for right now?
Yeah, and I think this is probably a great example of why we want to have the ability to call audibles when we move down the road.
Okay.
One of those trends we'll want to continually track is population against our assumptions, which then says, if it's different, let's adjust.
Okay.
So it's a good example of why we'd want to do this.
I've got Pat and Alan in the queue. I just wanted to make one little comment, and that is, in terms of they keep the comments that everybody makes individually, and they record those. And it's just a way of people knowing that their comments have been heard. And you can look and see what other people have said and be reminded of what other people have said. But those are not taken as policies that people have decided on or recommendations that people have made. That helps inform the discussion as it moves along, and then there's a larger conversation that happens where they reach their actual points of what they want to they've agreed on, I guess is what I would say. Is that an accurate representation?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Pat.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to say pretty much what the mayor just said, and that we have pages and pages and pages of the comments, and if you read all the comments, if you took any one of them and put it up there and thought of it as a strategy or as a tactic, you'd be alarmed at some of the things that have been written by me. So it's, what? Read the forum, read the report. But seriously, the city manager has taken reams and reams and reams of information and trying to dilute it down into short presentations like this, that if you take any one facet of it, it could be alarming, or it could be sending your thought pattern in the complete wrong direction. But ultimately, what the staff is doing, or my perception of what the staff is doing, is they're boiling it all down, and they're going to put out a plan. And John just mentioned calling audibles the line of scrimmage. I don't think you use the line of scrimmage, but that's the context that it really is in, is that there's a game plan that the manager is going to be laying out with a certain amount of flexibility that has to happen based on in-migration of refugees or natural growth in the area that can't really be predicted. So what we'll be seeing will be a game plan with the potential for pitching the ball to the wide receiver.
Thank you for that game analogy. Alan, you're next.
I'm actually keeping tabs of metaphors for Chris.
I was going to say, metaphor's going to start to get
sports
jealous
versus
here.
auto, and it's 4 sports and auto 0.
To come up with something different.
So
Whack-a-mole is still the favorite, right?
auto metaphor fans better chime in. Well, just to carry on that, the whole point of this Envision Eugene exercise is to listen. And I applaud the staff for listening and absorbing all of this, and how it actually gets implemented, I think, is more of an absorption of all that stuff through the policies as opposed to any one particular thing turning into a strategy. So I think it's the cumulative effect of all of that that is the value of the CRG in particular, and that's great. Specifically on the form-based code, when we were talking about an open space, we're talking about the Walnut Mixed-Use Center, which our part of the neighborhood has been intimately involved with because it's the first one. A lot of that conversation goes around open space as hardscape with planters and things like that. So integrating that into it as within the form-based code as part of open space as well. So not just what we typically think of as undeveloped land out in the middle of nowhere. So it has a whole bunch of different connotations, especially within form-based code, I think. And then on the climate refugees, Bob Dopplet and his group are the folks that actually, I think, coined the phrase. And their analysis that talked about the impacts on the Willamette Valley, which is a very good read, by the way, there's a pretty lengthy discussion about the climate refugees, and it actually tries to quantify it. I don't remember what it is in particular, but it kind of ranges it. And it ranges from modest to startling. But none of that was incorporated in the statistical analysis that PSU did. So yeah, 34,000 could be low.
speak up.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Let's see if we can get back to where we left off.
Making your presentation hard, aren't we?
So I'm going to take the next two topic areas, excuse me, together just a little bit. They're related in how they intersect with Envision Eugene, and that would be critical habitats and farm and forest lands. Before I do that, I want to show you this image here, which a few months ago the Community Resource Group identified places around Eugene that they felt were very important to them. We kind of termed these sacred spaces or sacred places for the exercise that we did. And this map just shows what people identified. So each one of those little hearts is a place that people felt was very important. And many of these being our community's most valuable natural resources. We have the Willamette River represented, the West Eugene wetlands, the South Hills, and of course farmland around the north end of town there. And it's a great example of why we've done so much over the years to protect these values. Starting with critical habitats, we're looking at two maps here, one from 1850 on the top left and one from 1990 on the bottom right. And these show different kinds of habitat in the Eugene and Springfield area. And the key message here is that several of these habitat types, including oak savanna, upland prairie, and wet prairie along waterways, have become very, very scarce since they were originally surveyed. They still exist in and around Eugene, and fortunately we've done a very good job here locally protecting some of these habitats, for example, through the West Eugene Wetlands Program. Protecting farm and forest lands really is the bedrock of our state land use regulations. That's why we have a UGB, one of the big reasons why. And the map on the left there, talking about farmland just for a minute, shows soil capability classes. And the part that I want to draw your attention to is the dark green color. So you can see the urban growth boundary there is a dark line. These are class 1 soils. So they're what are considered the best farm soils. And state law really focuses on protecting class 1 soils. And the reason is that not all soils are created equal. Not all of them are suitable for farming. For example, class 3 and 4 soils are described as severe and having severe and very severe limitations for agriculture. So something to keep in mind. So the reason state law requires us to be thoughtful about growth is because it permanently replaces what is a finite resource, and all of these things are. And these are just a few of the biggest considerations regarding that we'll need to balance through Envision Eugene. Reducing our ability to produce food and other products locally is a consideration, and obviously this becomes more important, not less important, as our population grows. And I'll just add that food security is an issue that we're starting to work on as a recommendation of the Climate and Energy Action Plan. Loss and fragmentation of habitat, impacting native plants and wildlife and wider ecological systems. And finally, we need to consider the potential loss of our cultural heritage, as well as economic values around farm and forest land. Moving on to water quality and stormwater. Taking water quality first, this is a simple diagram that shows 24 groups of water quality measures, and these are for the Amazon and the Willamette River Basin. They measure different things like chemicals and water clarity and that sort of thing. 23 of these groups of measures are staying the same or declining. One is improving. Having said that, there's reason to be hopeful. Most notably would be the recent adoption of water quality standards for Eugene, which of course are aimed directly at addressing this issue. And another local trend is that we're working hard to improve water quality in other ways. Some of you have seen the project out at Delta Ponds, which is bringing water flow into an area that hasn't seen water flow for 50 years. So that's improving habitat value and also water quality and helping mitigate stormwater impacts. So it's a good segue into stormwater because there are stormwater considerations as we plan for future development. Here in Eugene, we have programs and tools that help mitigate some of the impacts and risks. Our stormwater standards, I think, are a really good example of that. The image in the middle of this slide here shows the stormwater facility along Crest Drive. And the aim of that is to reduce runoff and the amount of contaminants that get into our waterways. We've also heard from the community that stormwater standards can make development more challenging in urban areas. So this is a good example of one of those balances that we'll need to strike. So finally, we'll summarize a few things to consider regarding water quality and stormwater. So the potential considerations include water pollution, increased runoff and flooding, erosion and degradation of waterways, loss of aquatic habitat, and of course, potentially changing the character of our community through loss of waterways. So finally, I'll touch base just a little bit on parks and open space, and needless to say, Eugene's parks and open spaces are absolutely vital to our quality of life here in Eugene. And not only do they provide all kinds of benefits, but they're also part of our identity. And we're constantly providing better and better service through the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Project and Priority Plan, which is a 20-year plan that we're implementing most recently through the 2006 bond, Parks Bond. Over the past decade alone, we've added hundreds and hundreds of acres of parks and made tremendous investments. So one other important trend related to that is to these improvements and these investments is that we also need to maintain the system. And that's a big challenge that we're facing here locally. So this slide really exemplifies what we want to, the point we want to make about the intersection of parks and open space in Envision Eugene. The slide's a little dark right now, but this is West University Park. And this happens to be not only one of our smallest parks, but it's the only park that serves one of the most densely populated areas of town. So thinking ahead as we consider using existing lands more efficiently, and in the places where population density does go up over time, we need to also consider how we can provide adequate parkland and make sure that our facilities are robust enough to serve the population. So that's a wrap for the presentation.
Thank you so much. I've got, I can raise a few, but before we do that, I want, and Alan, I wanted to give our guests, people who've been giving so many hours of their time and commitment to this, a chance to, no pressure, if there's any observations or a message that you want council to hear, I want to give you that opportunity right now. You want?
Sure. I mean, as an architect, I think our profession, we've drank the Kool-Aid and we believe in a lot of this, and we really are striving to help people understand how that makes practical sense to talk about a lot of these items. So I won't repeat them, but there is a lot of synergy, and I think at a high level and how that impacts what Envision Eugene is doing, it really is important to watch the transportation. And so to the extent that we can facilitate greater density within the current UGB and even closer into the core, I think that's very, very valuable in the long run. And similarly, the transit corridors for the synergy of the investment, particularly in fixed route transit, as a very strong motivator and incentive for the private development to follow along that, I think is also a very key opportunity that we have right now in Eugene. But my other comment would be, I know a lot of you are asking a lot of great detailed questions about the data, and it resonates with me because for all the days that we meet, I know a lot of us, including me, are questioning that also. And I kind of liken it to, I mean, the process is not perfect, but it's very good. And I feel like we've got good rails on things to guide us in a direction, if not a specific destination. And so I know there are a lot of people kind of poking at this or that, and I'd hate to kind of unravel the whole tapestry if we follow that game of poking and unraveling, and let's keep our eye on the prize. I guess.
Words of wisdom.
My 2 cents. Thank you for letting this come.
Kate?
Well, I guess I look at the process as something that's not only a great educational opportunity for everybody participating, but as a sort of a community exercise in building coalition and cooperation. And Rusty and I have served on the Economic Development Committee together, and at times we, or at least I, would say that we have competing interests in terms of, somebody looking for larger industrial lots and perhaps outside the UGB, and for my own, that would be how I would categorize Rusty. But for my own self, I strongly believe in the need for our community to be able to feed itself into the future, given the precarious nature of fossil fuel energy and how that has subsidized our food system in our country and around the world for the last however many decades. And have looked at all the maps and look at some studies with quantitative data of Lane County's ability to feed itself, and realize that that's a very, even in 2002 USDA census numbers, that's a limited possibility. And so as we look at increasing population and a decreasing amount of agricultural base to be able to do that, it makes me a little bit alarmed. And I think that that it's important to, in my estimation, when we look at state land use law, and it only requires us to provide a 20-year supply of residential, industrial, and commercial lands, I think it's sort of the lowest possible common denominator for looking at the health of a community. If we aren't looking to provide ourselves with 20 years of food-growing soil and 20 years of clean water and enough clean air, then we're only looking at part of the picture, because really what makes us a thriving and livable community is all those things together. And so being able to motivate the community around the possibility of creating a much more robust effort to make best use of what we have inside the UGB, I think is a well-spent amount of energy and resource, and I think it will pay back in spades in a way that thinking of ourselves as land-rich and resource-poor, and instead, so if we think of ourselves as land-rich and resource-poor, it becomes most efficacious to expand the UGB, bring in more land, call it ours, and use it in whatever way we see. If we look at ourselves as land stable, not necessarily poor, but what we have is what we have, and needing to apply our resource best to make that vibrant and useful, I think we get more as a community. There's a synergy that happens in terms of creating viable, livable, workable, industrial, commercial, residential spaces that are close in, that really gives us more as a community in the end. And so I see that the process of bringing everybody, all these competing interests and ways of looking at the world together in a room and really working through some of these things, it really is a helpful and interesting process. And I have to say I went into it fairly skeptically, and I am not a Bible thumper, but I'm a convert. and I really look forward to being able to consider a workable future, which is really the end goal. So,
Rusty?
I'm Rusty Rexius. I used to work at Rexius. Now I do this. Kate has learned I'm normally right. It's very helpful. I actually thought we were supposed to come and talk about environmental stewardship, and I'm glad to hear that I don't have to talk about that. I do want to mention something about that, but on a broader basis, if that's okay, it's just sort of if I could bring a message to council from my perspective of the CRG member who has made nearly all of these meetings and has invested a great deal of time. I think yesterday might have been a very good reflection and and a helpful story to tell is I was sitting at a table with Kevin Matthews, Debbie Jeffries, Rob Bennett, and myself. That's not a typical group to get together and have a civil conversation. And what was interesting about that, although the conversation wasn't absolutely in agreement, it was civil. And Kevin and I actually exchanged some emails afterwards. And the point that I think I want to make is that there is a genuine effort on the part of, I think, everybody to come to a place where whatever recommendations we make, and we realize they are merely recommendations, we've got zero decision-making ability, and that what we deliver to the city manager, and our hope is that council recognizes that one of the goals that we have, although I don't think we've actually said it, it came up yesterday in the conversation that I just mentioned, that one of the benefits of this process is that if the recommendations that we develop and John brings to you are at least strongly considered as viable, there's probably not a great big fight coming afterwards. And I promise you, if it doesn't go down the road that I think this is going, there will be a fight. I mean, people have already said it. So I'm hopeful that what we're doing here is preventing a war. And I know you're not supposed to say West Eugene Parkway, but a war that would look a lot like that didn't end well from anybody's perspective, I don't think. So that's my overarching sort of message from, I think I could speak on behalf of the CRG, that's kind of what we're all hoping, is that this be taken seriously. At a little more specific level, I want to just say two things that I think ultimately will relate to environmental stewardship. One of them, Larry started to mention, and some of the people in the room are sick of hearing this, but I want to say it because it's going to come up. And as we develop this plan around densifying, particularly around our urban core, which I think everybody agrees with, that makes a great deal of sense, and it's probably necessary. The challenge that we have, and I think Rob Ennerfeld is in the room, and he's really sick of me here saying this, the challenge that we have is that is at complete odds with our transportation plan, completely. If we are successful in developing a plan to put more people in smaller places in a confined area, it necessarily means we're going to have those more people to move around. And if we don't solve that problem, we're shooting ourselves in the foot before we ever get out of the gate. So I'm hopeful that this group is thinking well in advance of that. I'm hoping you've already solved that problem and we just don't know about it. Because I mean, I'm personally living it in our little project, and I know that it's going to be our primary obstacle to doing what we think is a good thing to do. So that's my personal plea. Figure it out, please, because it's going to bite us in the rear end. The last thing I'll say as sort of somewhat of a personal agenda, I have great fears, Kate already mentioned it, around not having adequate industrial lands. I'm not fearful that we don't have enough quantity of acres. I'm fearful that we don't have enough quality of acres. And one of the things that dawned on me is we've talked a lot about trying to do some assembling of industrial lands to create bigger parcels in the core, and that makes sense to me, and that there's a place for that, for sure. One of the loggerheads with that is what that does is brings that industrial traffic right downtown, right where you don't want it. So in thinking a little bit about what we do about quality industrial lands, and I'm not arguing that we go out into the prime farmlands at all. In fact, I have become a Bible thumper that that's a big mistake. But we do need to find a place to do that, and it ought to be where we can minimize our transportation requirements. And so I'm hoping that as we think a little bit further ahead about where the likely, logical, sensible place from everybody's perspective to put those qualitative industrial lands, that we're thinking about the transportation component, not just ground to put them. And we should use more compost to deal with hydrocarbons.
Yeah, right. I guess what I want to add to their eloquent comments, having attended almost all these meetings myself, is I think you couldn't help but be impressed with, and you see it demonstrated today, all of those people bring such an immense amount of passion. Now, you've heard the passion in the community criticized many times, but I think what you see demonstrated in this process is sort of the gift of passion for many different things in our community, and that they are all being brought to the table together, and people are really talking to each other and really trying to find a way to value all the things that people are passionate about. So if I were going to change that picture with all the hearts about things that people value, I think maybe I'd put a big heart over the whole community, because there's something that people love and have value for in the entire community and surrounding area, and they all have their voices, and they're trying to think together about it and ensure that we have a good future for our community. And you couldn't ask for people who care more about that than this group of people. And while I'm at it, I'll just make another big old pitch and say, and you couldn't ask for your staff that have worked harder or have more passion about this being successful themselves. So it is a really, I mean, I think that's demonstrable that in all the time I've been in this position, I have never seen a process that allowed the level of both staff expertise to come to the discussion and staff participation in the discussion, and it's benefited us all immensely. I think you'd all agree with that have participated in it. So anyway, with that, I've got Mike, Chris, Alan, and Pat. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I, too, appreciate everybody's work and effort. I attended several of these when we began, haven't had a chance to lately, but I really think an important process for helping us with the final decision-making. I want to take us back to stormwater for a second and water quality issues. And by way of kind of foreshadowing my questions, I'll say that I think the city decades ago made some missteps in creating a liability for the city in how we looked to annex, or the process by which we let people annex to the city, and in doing so, bringing county standard roads within the city. And as a process, we've created for ourselves an entire inventory of unimproved roads that aren't brought up to a city standard, that we aren't even talking about really getting to as a strategy yet, but a fairly large liability for the city to deal with, just because we didn't have a plan for how to convert them to a city standard before they were annexed in. And in a similar way, there's kind of a looming potential liability of a similar nature in the northern part that I'm aware of. Kate and I were both at a Santa Clara Community Organization meeting here a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about the number of dry wells that exist in the area up there, and the new water quality standards, as I understand it, and maybe I don't have this exactly right, show that needing to be dealt with, because that system for dealing with stormwater and runoff in those areas can't really be relied on under these new set of guidelines, as I understand it. So as we're considering where the UGB might be in that area, and when we're considering the process by which we're working with the county to make better use of our 190 agreements, or those properties that come into the city, I'm hoping that we have a really good plan for how to develop the things that we want to develop, and dealing with those dry well problems at the same time, how we're going to deal with those. Do we have any kind of planning to this point on that? Because I think there are some owned by the city, and there are some owned by the county, and there are some owned by individuals. So,
Mike?
Heather O'Donnell.
Hi, Heather O'Donnell at the Planning Division. So we're aware of the dry well issue, and you're right, there's standards right now that are in effect that require greater separation than a lot of our dry wells have. And so Public Works is working on identifying where those dry wells are and what a plan is for replacing them, whether it's going into an existing system or providing a new sort of not a dry well, but some other system that would actually be on private property. And we're coordinating with them on that, because that could have an impact on our buildable lands inventory. So we're coordinating with them on that.
For those that don't know, I mean, most of the parts of the city have stormwater pipes and systems for dealing when we see, as we've seen here, the increased wetter winters and more storms and more floods. We're going to have more stormwater, not less. And there are parts of the city that have piping and ability to deal with that, but especially in the Santa Clara area, there is none. It just goes into great big holes we've dug and lets the earth seep it into where the drinking water is, too, in some cases. So this is something we have to deal with in advance, I think.
Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, Chris, you're next.
Thanks. I couldn't appreciate more the work that the group is doing, and the reason is, and I can kind of stay at the 30,000-foot level. I'm not ready to get into details yet. There's a lot of them that we don't have. But I appreciate what we're trying to do at the kind of the aspirational higher level, and something that I really got very strongly when I was in D.C. a couple of weeks ago was the notion that you have to be intentional in what you're doing. And for me, I think that's the key concept here is what are we doing intentionally versus what is going to happen unintentionally. And while we have made mistakes intentionally, first one that comes to mind is a downtown covered mall in the 60s. That was an intentional mistake. But
I meant it to be a mistake, Chris.
I think it was. And that's why it's an opinion. But nevertheless, our ability to make intentional mistakes is much less than our ability to make unintentional mistakes. They happen a lot more often when they're unintentional. And to me, Envision Eugene is our effort to try to be intentional in what we're doing. And I know that there are positions in the community that say, just let things happen the way they're going to happen. Just let them happen. I mean, it'll all work out in the end, or it'll happen the way it's supposed to. And the reason I can't buy into that is because I can see over and over and over again that when you just leave things to happen on their own, you get unintentional mistakes. And that doesn't mean I want to control everything, and I want intentionality to be something that we mutually agree on, which is what I think this process is about. I don't want my intentions to somehow be the ones that are in charge. But I just simply cannot say, just let the unintentional take over. We talked about how much of West 11th will we zone, or what will become the industrial area. What do we envision the future to be? We've got to be intentional about it. We have to be intentional. If we just say, well, let it go the way it's going to go, we'll just let it be the way it's going to be, or let one person or one group decide what it's going to be, is really not going to be helpful. That's what makes this effort so critically important. It's our effort to bring different interests together to try to create that intentional future. And so I keep coming back to that notion. That's going to be what's going to save us all, is that we get intentional about what we plan to do. And we work it through in however long it needs to take, and we can avoid the war. Because I agree, there will be a war if we don't get intentional and we don't start working that way. That means we got to put our hands on and not just keep our hands off. And as much as it's tempting, because it's easy to just let things go where they're going to go, we will get into a car wreck if we take our hands off the wheel. So we've got that. I used two different metaphors there, so that's keeping score.
That's 6, I think.
So that's why I think this work is so incredibly important. And I think they're going in the right direction, and I think the details will be the parts that get worked out. But I can't reinforce how important I think it is that we do this process, and we do it the way we're doing it. And I know some people don't like it because maybe it doesn't give them the ability to be involved in ways they'd like to, but we got to stick with it and see it through.
Thanks, Chris. Next, Alan.
Sports 4, Auto 1.
Yeah.
The conversation that we're having and the listening that we're doing and the whole idea of bringing together unlikely folks into the same conversation, and what that leads to is compromise and agreement to avoid a meltdown was one of my goals of this, and I applaud the staff for doing that. I think it has worked out, and the work that you have all done has been great, and the work that the CRG has done and the amount of time people have put into it is unbelievable, and it really speaks well to how much people love this community and care about it and want it to be better as we move forward. I'm more confident about getting to where we're going to get today than I was a month ago, so because it's starting to now gel. And it's one of those things where you wait, and then it happens, and I think that's where we're at with this process. And the civility of it is great. I was struck yesterday after watching the State of the Union speech that the talking heads were talking about how boring the whole thing was, and I felt like saying, you guys missed the point. It was civil. It wasn't boring. You didn't have people shouting out and things like that. I'm all for boring, if that's what that means, because that's what civility is all about. I was particularly impressed with this presentation because you guys often when people talk about environmental stewardship, and it's very amorphous, you can't get your hands around it. It's not specific enough. And I think you guys did a masterful job of being clear and specific about what this process means in a very specific way with regard to all these different elements. And you did a good job of laying that out. Now, integrating that back into the process is the and the results and the strategies that we adopt is really going to be the hallmark of this, I think. And just to underscore one that I think is incredibly important is the intersection of transportation and land use. That is particularly important. And the attachment A, hopefully that everybody read that. If you haven't, it's great. It has a laundry list of things that are related to that particular intersection of transportation and land use, because that's where most of this, what we're doing in Envision Eugene, is really, really about. And that's the tough part. That's what the WAC was all about and all these other kinds of things. And then the other thing that I was struck with is that several people said, well, what ever happened to infill compatibility standards and off-siting? And well, it's now coming back into the process and filtering all that stuff we did. It's now filtering into this process, where it's exactly where it should be. And now it's starting. Now we're going to have to start to make the tough decisions about that. And then finally, John, your assumptions about being aggressive but not unrealistic, I think, is exactly where you want to be in the early stages of this kind of planning process.
Pat?
Thank you, Mayor. You've not gotten the aviation analogy yet.
Yeah, that's true.
I see
Chris
you
and
have a
Mike
competition going here,
Chris and Mike are flying at 30,000 feet
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, it's 6.
Occasionally dipping down underneath the radar.
Or it's subterranean.
So let's go orbital for a while. Actually, each time Larry says something and Katie says something and Rusty says something, I have lots of things I'd like to add, but it really is at the risk of getting into too much detail, which isn't what this meeting is about. The only thing that I'm going to add at this point is that when we first got together as a group, there were a lot of folded arms, a lot of leaning back in the chair. And the transformation that I've witnessed over the course of the sessions that we've had, the lengthy sessions that we've had, is that all of a sudden people have started looking at each other and there aren't folded arms. In fact, yesterday when we finished, I would characterize it as a group hug that we all had. And a couple of things that were said, I just want to put this in perspective to impart a little bit of the confidence that I have that this group is really given a good direction, despite the many different directions we came from originally. Bill Slattery and Kevin Matthews agreed on a number of things at the end of the day yesterday, and they were looking at each other very civilly, and Bill saying, well, I don't have the same views that I had on the urban growth boundary before. And Kevin Matthews was saying, well, thank you for the input. And it's just really an amazing thing, as Mayor Piercy has stated, to see all of these different views come together. And Katie just said, I no longer feel, and I don't recall the exact word, but you didn't feel the way you felt going into the series of meetings. Everybody has that same feeling. And so the presentation that you're going to receive from the city manager comes with a great deal of input from a very broad cross-section of the community. And it's I have every confidence that a lot of things that we all have questions about have been talked about, and in a few short meetings you're going to get distillation of a great deal of product into a few words from the city manager. So I have, once again, every optimism and a great deal of confidence in the work that this group has performed. Thank you.
Anybody else have anything they want to add to the mix? George, Betty, anybody? Questions?
I had one thing.
Yes.
So I was struck by Councilor Pryor's comments about the deliberate quality of what we've engaged in as a process, and I heartily agree with that. And it just, when I put that in the input end, what comes out the output end is to really encourage you, the City Council and the Mayor, to not, I think everybody who's involved in the process is apprehensive because there's a date certain deadline that we've been looking at and trying to make progress by a date certain deadline, and realizing on some level that the group process is almost an organic being that's sort of taken on a life of its own, and it's developing at its own rate. And it is developing, I think, in a way that most everybody who's participating in it feels good about. There's a great deal of compromise and common ground that we're finding, and we still have our, rubbing points where we don't all agree, but if we were to look at the process and say, well, we've hit date certain, and we're still, as an organism, only in the formative or teenage, coming together years, but it hasn't actually matured into the whole being, I would say do your best to appreciate that there is a biological timeline to every process, and this one has its, I think, developing rate, and the rate is increasing. So the ability for it to come to fruition is happening at a faster rate than it was at the beginning of the process, but it might not be ready by February 28th. And so if it's at all possible to appreciate the process for what it is and not truncate the process, I think the outcome is going to be better for the community, for your decision-making process, and for the livability of Eugene for decades. So
Thank you for that. Just bring that up. Okay, anything else? Yes?
I just had one question. Somebody mentioned cultural heritage. Did you think of Civic Stadium when you thought of that?
It has come up.
Who wants to be on the spot?
Well, it was mostly referring to farm and forest lands at that point, and the cultural heritage associated with...
of the farms.
Yeah, with farms and forests.
Thank you.
But I would say, Betty, that when they went through what you love, there were some in the room who would love that. So, I mean, that was part of it.
I saw a hard sticker on Civic Stadium.
To that extent, that was one of the things that the people in the room talked about and cared about. Anything else? Okay, thank you all very, very much. Onward. Okay, that ends our meeting for today.